The document was not signed in the throne room, not in a state office, not in front of any camera, but on a quiet corner desk inside Buckingham Palace, where a single line of ink rewrote the internal hierarchy of the House of Windsor and placed Princess Charlotte at the center of a role no child of her generation was ever expected to hold this soon. The palace did not tremble because of the announcement. It trembled because of the silence that followed it. For 72 hours, no advisor briefed the press, no aide leaked the details, no courtier confirmed the scope, and inside the private apartments of Clarence House, a teacup was reportedly left untouched on a side table for the length of an entire afternoon. The room where King Charles finalized the decision was not lit for ceremony. It was lit for consequence. And in that consequence sat a truth the monarchy had been quietly preparing for years. A truth that would land hardest not on the public, not on the press, not even on the young princess herself, but on the woman who had spent 2 decades learning to stand exactly one step behind the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room in which the decision was signed measured no more than 14 paces across. A modest working study on the first floor of Buckingham Palace, its walls lined with dark green damask, its single window looking down onto the inner quadrangle where pigeons had gathered on the gravel, as if unaware that anything had changed. King Charles sat at a walnut desk that had belonged to his grandfather, and on that desk lay 3 items arranged with the deliberate neatness of a man who had rehearsed this hour privately for months. There was a slim leather folder, embossed in gold with the royal cipher. There was a fountain pen, uncapped, and there was a single sheet of cream-colored paper bearing a paragraph so short that a stranger might have mistaken it for a note of thanks. The king did not read it aloud. He did not need to. Standing at the far side of the room, half in shadow, was a senior member of the private secretariat, a figure whose title, in simple terms, means the person who translates a monarch's private will into the machinery of the state. He held a second folder. That folder contained the schedule of every royal engagement for the next 12 months, and inside it one name had already been quietly reassigned. That mattered because in the monarchy, a diary entry is not a suggestion. It is a verdict. For Queen Camilla, the news did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as a pause. She was seated in the yellow drawing room of Clarence House when a senior aide entered without knocking, a breach of protocol so small that only someone inside the household would have registered it, and she understood at once that whatever came next would not be routine. The aide did not sit. He did not offer the customary preamble. He simply placed a folded briefing sheet on the table between them and stepped back. And in that stepping back lay the entire message. For a woman who had spent a lifetime reading the geometry of rooms, the distance he kept was louder than any sentence. She read the paper once. She read it again. She did not react. That mattered because Camilla's greatest strategic asset had always been her stillness, the ability to receive a blow without letting the blow become visible. And in that moment, the stillness was doing the work of an entire private army. Somewhere down the corridor, a clock chimed the quarter hour, and she noticed, with the strange clarity of shock, that she had never before heard it so clearly. For Prince William, the same information landed in an entirely different register. He received the update in a working office at Kensington Palace, standing rather than sitting, still holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand while he read a briefing on housing policy. His private secretary, a man trained to deliver news in the flattest possible tone, said only one sentence, and William did not answer for nearly 30 seconds. That silence was not confusion. It was calculation. For the reluctant successor, in simple terms, the heir who has spent his life aware that every promotion within the family is also a subtraction from someone else's life. The elevation of his daughter carried a joy and a weight that could not be separated. He set the cup down. He asked a single quiet question about timing. Then he asked to be left alone. That mattered because William, more than any other figure in the House of Windsor, understood that a child given a role too early is not being crowned. She is being conscripted. And he had lived that conscription himself. For Princess Catherine, the news came as she was arranging a small vase of white roses in a private sitting room, and she stopped mid-motion, one stem held between her fingers, and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment before she resumed. She did not speak. She placed the last stem. She stepped back to examine the arrangement, and only then did she allow herself to close her eyes. The steady stabilizer, in simple terms the figure whose composure holds the emotional weather of the household together, was doing what she always did, converting private turbulence into visible order. But behind that order, a mother's mind was already sprinting through the next 10 years of her daughter's life. That mattered because Catherine knew, with a specificity no palace document could contain, exactly which parts of a young girl's childhood would now be quietly surrendered. For Princess Charlotte herself, the moment arrived in the smallest possible way. She was told gently in a private room at Windsor by both of her parents together, and the conversation was framed not as an elevation but as a request. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She did not smile, and she did not frown. She simply nodded once, the way children nod when they understand that something being said to them is not really a choice. That mattered because Charlotte, at her age, already carried the strange dual awareness peculiar to royal children, the knowledge that love and duty are not opposites, but instructions written in the same hand. When she left the room, she walked, according to a documented private account, with the careful posture of a child who had just been handed something breakable. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to a dinner held 18 months earlier, in a private dining room at Highgrove, where the king had gathered a small circle of family and advisors under the pretext of an ordinary Sunday meal. The candles were lit low, the table was set for 8, and halfway through the second course, the king, without raising his voice, had asked a question that no one at the table had been prepared for. He had asked what the monarchy would look like in the year 2050, and he had asked each person present to answer in turn. Camilla had spoken first, with warmth and generalities. William had spoken second, with restraint. Catherine had spoken third, and her answer, brief as it was, had turned the room. She had said that the monarchy would survive only if it began preparing the next generation, not in their 20s, but in their childhoods. And that preparation, she had added quietly, must include daughters, not only sons. The king had said nothing for a long moment. He had then reached for his water glass, and the motion of that glass across the tablecloth had left a faint damp trail that no one at the table would forget. That mattered because in that trail lay the first physical trace of a decision that would take a year and a half to become ink. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not shouted. It unfolded in a small private sitting room adjoining the king's study, where Camilla had asked for a moment of his time, and where the door was closed behind them by an aide who then walked, very deliberately, to the far end of the corridor. She sat. He sat. Between them lay a low table with a single porcelain cup, its handle turned outward untouched. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She asked him, in the plainest language she had used with him in years, whether he had considered what this would do to the balance of the household. And he answered her, in the plainest language he had used with anyone in months, that he had considered nothing else for a very long time. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them looked away. That mattered, because in a marriage that had survived by the careful management of what was said and what was withheld, the moment of direct eye contact carried the weight of a public declaration. She asked one further question, quieter than the first. He answered it with a single word, and the silence that followed was the sound of a chapter closing. The machinery began to move the following morning, and it moved with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had been rehearsing this transition in the margins of its ledgers for far longer than the public understood. A folder was carried from the private secretariat to the office of the Lord Chamberlain. In simple terms, the official who oversees the ceremonial life of the royal household, and inside that folder was a revised list of patronages, appearances, and formal duties. 3 items on that list had been reassigned. A seat at an autumn state banquet, previously left blank, now bore a name. A place in a Christmas Day procession, previously assumed to be filled by another figure, had been quietly reallocated. and a small blue box containing a piece of jewelry once worn by the late queen on her first public engagement as a child had been transferred from a vault in one wing of the palace to a locked drawer in another. That mattered because in the monarchy, jewelry is never merely jewelry. It is inheritance in physical form, and its movement across corridors is the truest map of who is rising and who is not. In the days that followed, other objects began to shift. A card bearing Camilla's name at a forthcoming charity luncheon was quietly reprinted. Its position on the seating chart moved by one place. A framed photograph in a public corridor of Buckingham Palace, which had for years shown a particular family grouping, was replaced with a new image in which the composition, subtly but unmistakably, had been rebalanced. An empty chair at a rehearsal for a state occasion, previously reserved for a senior royal, was now marked with a small paper tag bearing the name of a child. None of these changes was announced. None was explained. And yet, to anyone inside the household trained to read the language of arrangement, they read like a sentence being written across the palace, one word at a time. That mattered because the monarchy communicates in objects long before it communicates in words. And by the time the words arrive, the objects have already done the work. The second jolt came 7 days later, in the form of a document that no one outside a very small circle was ever meant to see. It was a memorandum, in simple terms an internal note circulated between senior members of the household, and it outlined, in careful language, a program of preparation for Princess Charlotte that would begin within the month. There would be lessons in constitutional history, tailored to her age. There would be quiet introductions to figures whose names the public would not recognize, but whose influence shaped the invisible architecture of the state. There would be a schedule of small, unannounced attendances at meetings she would not speak in, would not be photographed at, and would not be told the full purpose of, but from which she would absorb by proximity the atmosphere of governance. The memorandum was 3 pages long, it was signed by no one, and it ended with a single sentence that read, according to a recorded internal note, that the preparation was to be conducted, quote, with the utmost gentleness and the utmost seriousness, unquote. That mattered because in the language of the palace, those 2 words placed side by side described the entire philosophy of raising a monarch. When Camilla read the memorandum, she read it alone, in the small study she used for her private correspondence, and she read it twice. She did not annotate it. She did not fold it. She placed it, very carefully, inside the drawer where she kept letters from her grandchildren, and she closed the drawer with both hands. That mattered because in that small gesture lay a decision she had made without speaking it aloud, a decision to absorb the news not as a wound but as an inheritance she would help carry. The displaced insider, in simple terms the figure who has spent decades earning a place at the center of the family only to feel the center shift beneath her, was choosing, in that closed drawer, the harder of the 2 available paths. She was choosing grace. And grace, in the House of Windsor, has always been the most expensive currency in the treasury. That evening the king came to her. He did not send an aide. He did not send a note. He walked, alone, through the corridor that connects their private apartments, and he knocked once on the door of her sitting room before entering. She was reading. She set the book down. He sat across from her, not on the chair he usually took, but on the smaller one nearer to her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. When he finally did, he did not speak as a king. He spoke as a husband who had asked his wife to carry something heavy on his behalf, and who understood that the asking itself was a form of debt. He told her, quietly, that he had needed to make this decision for reasons that lay beyond the 2 of them, and that he had needed her, specifically, to be the person who did not oppose it, because her not opposing it was the signal the rest of the household would read. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she reached across the small distance between them and placed her hand on his, and she said only one sentence, brief and private, that the aide waiting in the corridor would later describe, in a documented private account, as sounding less like agreement and more like absolution. That mattered because in that sentence, the marriage did what the institution could not. It forgave the cost. Outside the palace walls, the public had begun to sense that something was shifting, though no one could yet name what it was. A small crowd had gathered at the gates of Buckingham Palace on the afternoon the story first broke into the newspapers, and among them stood an elderly woman in a navy coat who had traveled, she told a passing broadcaster, from a town 3 hours to the north because she had wanted to be near the building on the day the announcement was confirmed. She did not carry a flag. She did not carry a photograph. She carried only a small handkerchief, which she pressed to her eyes when the broadcaster asked her why she had come. She said, quietly, that she remembered the day the late Queen had been a young girl learning her duties, and that she had never expected to live long enough to see another child of that age asked to begin the same long walk. She said it once, she did not repeat it, and she turned away from the camera before the tears could be recorded in full. That mattered because in her single unrepeated sentence lay the emotional register the palace itself had been unable to articulate. The newspapers, when they arrived the following morning, did not shout. They did not need to. The front page of one broadsheet carried a single photograph of Princess Charlotte, taken months earlier at an ordinary public engagement, and beneath it a headline of only 4 words, set in a typeface larger than the paper had used in years. The words were plain, the words were exact, and the words, read aloud, sounded less like news than like a verdict already delivered. On the television, a senior broadcaster, a woman whose career had been built on the discipline of understatement, opened her evening bulletin with a single framing line that would be repeated across the country for days afterward. She said, according to a documented broadcast record, that the monarchy had, in the quiet of a single week, done something it had not done in a generation. She said it once, she moved on, and the country understood. Inside the palace, the corridors that evening were emptier than usual. A footman later recalled, in a documented private account, that the sound of his own footsteps on the marble had seemed unusually loud, as though the building itself were holding its breath. In one of the private sitting rooms, a lamp had been left burning past the hour when the lamps were normally extinguished, and beneath its light sat a small stack of correspondence that would not be opened until morning. In another room, a child's drawing had been placed on a side table, carefully framed, its edges still slightly uneven from a young hand. And in a third room, the smallest and least visited of them all, Queen Camilla sat alone with a single photograph in her hands, a photograph of herself as a young woman, taken long before any of this had begun, and she looked at it for a long time before she set it down. That mattered because in that looking lay the private reckoning no memorandum could contain, the quiet acknowledgement that a life shaped by proximity to the crown had always carried, from its very first day, the possibility of this exact moment. The following morning, the household resumed its work with the disciplined ordinariness that has always been the monarchy's greatest performance. Breakfast trays were carried, diaries were consulted, aides moved along the corridors with the practiced neutrality of people who had been trained, over decades, to treat the extraordinary as though it were routine. And in a small anteroom on the ground floor, Princess Charlotte was introduced, for the first time, to a woman who would, in the years to come, guide the earliest stages of her formal preparation. The woman did not curtsy deeply. She did not speak in the elaborate cadences of court. She sat down on a low chair, placed a small folder of illustrated papers on the table between them, and asked the child, gently, what she already knew about the country she lived in. Charlotte answered carefully. The woman listened. And in that first quiet exchange, a program began that would, in time, reshape the interior life of the House of Windsor. That mattered because the truest transfers of power in the monarchy have never occurred on balconies. They have occurred at low tables, in small rooms, over folders of illustrated papers, in the presence of women whose names the public will never learn. Elsewhere in the palace, the king had returned to his study, and he had returned to it alone. The leather folder that had contained the original document was gone, transferred to an archive whose access was restricted to a handful of individuals. The fountain pen had been capped and returned to its stand. The single sheet of cream-colored paper had been countersigned, filed, and sealed, and in its place on the desk lay a new folder thicker than the first, containing the next stage of the plan. He opened it. He read the first page. He did not smile, and he did not frown. He simply lifted the pen once more, uncapped it, and began, in the small, careful hand that had defined his correspondence for half a century, to write. That mattered because the fading center, in simple terms, the monarch who understands that his reign will be measured not by what he built, but by what he arranged before he left, was doing the work of arrangement in the only handwriting he trusted, his own. Down the corridor, in the yellow drawing room where the news had first arrived, Camilla was receiving her morning briefing. She sat in the same chair she had sat in a week earlier. The aide who delivered the briefing was the same aide who had delivered the first folded sheet. But this morning he sat and he offered the customary preamble, and the small breach of protocol that had marked the earlier meeting was not repeated. That mattered because in the restoration of that small ritual lay the household's quiet acknowledgement that the balance, though shifted, had been reset. The queen consort was not diminished. She was, in the language the palace understood, repositioned. And repositioning in the monarchy is not a loss. It is a role. For William, the days that followed carried a specific and private weight. He walked his daughter to a car one morning, held the door for her as he had done 1,000 times before, and watched her settle into the seat with the small serious expression she had worn since the conversation in the private room at Windsor. He did not speak as the car pulled away. He stood for a long moment on the gravel, hands in his pockets, watching the taillights disappear along the drive. And when he turned to walk back into the house, he did so slowly, the way a man walks when he has just handed something precious to an institution, and is trying, with each step, to convince himself that the institution will be worthy of it. That mattered because the reluctant successor had, in that single walk, done the thing his own father had once done for him, and his grandmother had once done for his father, and the long chain of that repetition was, in the end, the true architecture of the crown. For Catherine, the same days carried a different discipline. She continued her engagements. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She spoke when spoken to, in the measured warmth that had become her public signature. But in the private hours of her evenings, she sat with her daughter more often, and she spoke less, and she listened more. She read to her from books she had read to her 100 times before, and she noticed with the particular attentiveness of a mother whose child has been given a new weight to carry, that Charlotte now paused at different sentences, asked different questions, lingered on different pages. That mattered because the preparation the memorandum had described was not in the end the preparation that would shape the child most deeply. The preparation that would shape her most deeply was the one occurring on a sofa in a private sitting room, in the low light of a single lamp, in the voice of a mother who was still, quietly, the truest teacher in the house. The public conversation, in the weeks that followed, moved through its predictable phases. There were columns of analysis. There were letters to editors. There were broadcasts in which historians spoke of precedent, and constitutional experts spoke of protocol, and commentators spoke of symbolism. But beneath all of it ran a quieter current, an emotional undertow that no analysis quite captured, and that undertow was the recognition, felt in kitchens and living rooms and on morning commutes across the country, that a child had been asked to begin a walk that no child should have to begin, and that the country, whether it wished to or not, was now walking beside her. That mattered because the monarchy, at its most enduring, has never been a matter of law. It has been a matter of the quiet contract between a family and the country that agrees, generation after generation, to watch that family carry a weight on its behalf. Inside the palace, one final scene closed the week. It occurred late in the evening, in a small private chapel used only rarely, and it involved no ceremony, no witnesses, and no record beyond the memory of the two people present. The king and the queen consort walked into the chapel together, and they sat, side by side, in the front pew. They did not pray aloud. They did not speak. They sat for perhaps a quarter of an hour, in a silence so complete that the small sounds of the building, in simple terms the settling of old wood and the faint hum of distant machinery, became audible. When they rose to leave, he offered her his arm, and she took it, and they walked out together into the corridor beyond. That mattered because in that walk, stripped of every title and every witness, They were not king and queen consort. They were a husband and a wife who had, together, done a hard thing, and who would, together, carry the consequences of it for the remainder of their lives. At the gates of the palace the following morning, the small crowd had grown larger. Among them were parents with young children lifted onto their shoulders, tourists who had rearranged their itineraries to be present, and, near the front, a young girl of perhaps Charlotte's age, holding a small hand-drawn card that she pressed against the railings. A broadcaster, moving through the crowd with a microphone, paused before her and asked gently what she had drawn. The girl held the card up. It showed two figures, one taller and one shorter, standing side by side beneath a crown that had been colored in with careful, uneven strokes of yellow crayon. The broadcaster did not ask a second question. He simply nodded, and the camera lingered on the drawing for a moment longer than editorial convention required. And in that lingering lay the entire meaning of the week. That mattered because the country had, without instruction, produced its own answer to the palace's silence. And the answer was drawn in crayon, and the answer was tender, and the answer was enough. In the end, the story of that week was not a story of promotion, nor of demotion, nor of rivalry, nor of scandal. It was a story of arrangement, quietly made, quietly signed, and quietly absorbed by the people whose lives it had rearranged. The king gave the decision. The queen consort gave the grace. The prince gave the reluctant, unwavering acceptance of a father who had walked this road himself. The princess gave the composure that had always been her hidden strength. And the child at the center of it all gave, in her single quiet nod, the only answer a child in her position could give. An answer that was neither yes nor no, but simply the beginning of a longer sentence that would take the rest of her life to complete. Somewhere in a locked drawer, a small blue box waited. Somewhere on a desk, a fountain pen rested in its stand. Somewhere, in a private sitting room, a lamp burned past its usual hour. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, the monarchy did what it has always done in its most consequential hours. It moved without sound. It moved without spectacle. It moved, one folder, one chair, one photograph at a time, into the shape it would carry into the century ahead. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.